The knock came before sunrise, but Clara Whitfield had not been sleeping. She stood at the narrow table in the center of the rented room, her fingers resting on a small stack of coins she had already counted 3 times. The number did not change. It never changed when she needed it to. Outside, the last of the September darkness pressed against the oilcloth window, and somewhere down the street in Harland Creek, a horse shifted in its stall, and the sound carried all the way to her like proof that the world was still moving, even when she was standing perfectly still. $4 short. She had spent the night working through every possibility, the way Thomas used to work through a surveying problem systematically without flinching from the answer. She could ask Dr. Marsh for an advance on the mending she had done for his office, but she had already asked twice this season, and the third time would cost her something she could not name but could feel. She could sell the iron pot, but the iron pot was how she fed her children, and feeding her children was the only negotiation she refused to enter. She could go to the church and sit across from Reverend Aldrich and accept whatever he offered, along with the expression that always accompanied it, that particular combination of pity and satisfaction that settled on his face whenever a widow appeared at his door. She had done that once in June. She had not done it since. None of the possibilities changed the number on the table. Nora sat in the far corner of the room where the ceiling slanted so low she could not stand fully upright, her needle moving through a torn grain sack with the steady patience of someone who had long ago decided that complaining about a task did not shorten it. She was 14 and already had her father's hands wide across the knuckles, precise in movement, and she had not asked a single question since Clara had come home from the market the evening before with less than she left with and more silence than usual. The girl understood arithmetic. She had understood it since she was 9. Samuel sat on the floor between the table and the cold stove, sorting dried beans into 2 piles, the good ones and the bad ones. He had assigned himself this task without being asked, which was the kind of thing he did 8 years old, and already with a surveyor's instinct for finding the useful work in a situation, the same instinct his father had carried into every room he entered. Sam had Thomas's eyes too, that particular shade of brown that went darker when he was thinking hard, and right now they were very dark indeed, as he turned each bean over in his small fingers before placing it in its proper pile. The knock, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. Elias Dunmore had been collecting debts in Harland Creek for 11 years, and he had learned that the knock of someone who holds power over another person does not need to announce itself. It simply arrives. Clara opened the door. Dunmore was a compact man in his mid-50s with the kind of stillness that comes not from patience but from the complete absence of doubt. He wore the same gray wool coat he wore every morning regardless of weather, and he held his hat in his left hand with the mechanical courtesy of someone who had been taught manners without being taught their purpose. He did not look past Clara into the room. He never did what she had once taken as a sign of discretion and now understood was simply indifference. She placed the coins into his palm one at a time, counting under her breath. He counted after her. The silence between them had the specific quality of a transaction, impersonal, inevitable, faintly humiliating. When the last coin had transferred hands, he counted the total a second time. Then he looked up. She held his gaze and did not shift her weight or soften her expression, because she had learned in the 14 months since Thomas died that the moment she showed softness to Elias Dunmore was the moment he would stop dealing with her and start managing her. And there was a difference between those two things that mattered enormously. $4 short, he said. Next week I'll have it. You said that 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago I was also $4 short. Next week I won't be. She did not know if this was true. She said it because it was the only sentence available that was not surrender. Dunmore looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not unkind and not cruel, and was somehow worse than either. He was a man who had simply calculated the likelihood of various outcomes and arranged his face accordingly. Then he put the coins in his coat pocket and put his hat back on his head and walked down the 2 wooden steps and along the dirt path toward the street without looking back. Clara closed the door. She stood with her hands still on the latch and listened to his footsteps fade. Behind her, Nora's needle continued its steady rhythm. Sam placed another bean in the good pile. The room smelled of damp wood and old straw and the faint ghost of a cooking fire from 2 days ago when there had been enough to cook properly. The frost had crept inside the lower corner of the window again, overnight, thin white fingers reaching across the glass, and the cold came through the walls in the particular way it did in this room, not as a draft, but as a slow, patient infiltration, the kind that finds its way into joints and stays. Clara sat down at the table. She did not move the coins because there were no coins left to move. She pulled Thomas's surveying notebook from the wooden crate beneath the table, the crate that held everything she had not sold, and set it in front of her. She had not opened it in 6 weeks, not because she was afraid of it, but because every time she opened it, she heard his voice reading the entries aloud in that precise, unhurried way he had, and she was not always in a condition to hear that voice and still function afterward. But last night, lying awake in the dark while Nora breathed quietly beside her, and Sam talked in his sleep about something involving a blue horse, she had thought about the notebook with a different quality of attention than grief. She had thought about it the way Thomas would have, as a document, as data. She opened it to the middle. His handwriting filled every page in tight economical rows, measurements, elevations, soil notations, water source, locations, boundary descriptions. The shorthand of a man who thought in terms of the land itself, its geometry, and its secrets. She had learned to read most of it in the years they were married, sitting beside him at this same table, while he transferred field notes into the permanent record. He had explained his symbols to her, not as a lesson, but as conversation, the way he talked about everything as if her understanding of it was simply expected and therefore not remarkable. She turned to page 47. She had turned to this page before months ago and not known what she was looking for. Now she did. The entry was dated October 1885, 2 years before he died, 18 months before they had any debt at all, back when Thomas was still writing county contracts, and the future seemed like a thing that would continue to arrive in the ordinary way. The handwriting was the same as every other page, but with one difference at the bottom. Below the technical notations, he had added 2 lines in a slightly different pressure, as if he had written them after returning to the page. Caldwell Ridge limestone karst eastern face. Warm air discharge observed at fissure approximately 40 feet inside main chamber. Steady, source geothermal subsurface water movement through limestone, not documented in county records. Unusual formation. And below that in smaller letters, the kind he used when he was writing something for himself rather than for the record worth returning to. He had never returned. Or if he had not told her. In the spring of 1887, the ground above the Tucker County mine had opened without warning, and Thomas Whitfield had fallen into a space that had not existed 3 seconds before, and the question of Caldwell Ridge had gone with him. Clara sat with the open notebook for a long time after that. The morning light was coming in now, gray and flat through the oilcloth, and Sam had moved from bean sorting to wood stacking at the side of the coal stove, and Nora had finished the grain sack and started on a torn hem without anyone asking her to. The room was functioning, her children were functioning. She was the part that had not yet resolved. The gust that came under the door that afternoon carried something with it, not cold, but the edge of cold, the kind that by November would be constant. She thought about the room in winter. She thought about the $4. She thought about page 47. She was still sitting there when the postal boy knocked. He left the package on the step without waiting, which was the postal boy's method with every delivery since the incident with the Hartley dog last summer. Clara picked it up. It was wrapped in rough burlap and tied with kitchen twine, addressed in handwriting she did not recognize, large unsteady letters, the writing of a man who did not write often. Inside, $47 in mixed coin and paper, and a folded land deed, and a letter on a single page. She read the letter standing at the open door with the burlap still in her hand. Mrs. Clara, I won this land in a card game this past July from a fellow who claimed it was worth something but could not say what. I had someone look at the deed. 17 acres on Caldwell Ridge, Pendleton County, rock and cave country, no farming to speak of, nobody wants it. I don't need it, and I have no use for it. But it belongs to you by right because Thomas was my brother, and you are his legal widow, and I am not a man who keeps what it isn't mine. I put in what cash I could spare because I heard things are not going well, and I am sorry I cannot do more. Do what you think is right with the land, Gerald W. She read it twice. Gerald Whitfield Thomas's younger brother, the one who had appeared at the wedding in a suit that didn't fit and left before the cake was cut, and sent a letter from somewhere in the western counties every year or so, never with a return address. Thomas used to say without bitterness that Gerald was the kind of man who was always on his way somewhere and never quite arrived. He said it with the particular affection of an older brother who has stopped expecting and started simply watching. She had met Gerald once. She had shaken his hand at the wedding. He had looked at Thomas with an expression she now recognized as a man cataloging something he knows he will lose. Nora appeared at her shoulder. Clara handed her the deed without comment. The girl unfolded it and read it with the systematic focus she brought to everything written, moving her lips slightly over the legal language, the way she did when she was converting its structure into something plain. Caldwell Ridge, Nora said. That's up past the Seneca Rocks cutoff. 3 days walk if the trail is hard. 2.5, Clara said. If we leave before dawn. Nora looked up, not with surprise. Nora very rarely looked surprised, which was either a gift or something Clara had accidentally trained into her, and she had never been sure which. What the girl's face showed instead was the swift, internal calculation of someone considering logistics, the same expression she wore when she was deciding how to distribute firewood across a week. When, she asked, we have 9 days before Dunore needs this room for a new tenant. Clara folded the letter along its original creases. We'll leave in 3. She did not explain the reasoning. She did not need to. 3 days was enough time to sell what remained of the furniture purchase, what they needed, and pack it onto the small handcart that had belonged to Thomas's surveying work and that Dunore had not yet claimed because it was technically a tool and not furniture. 3 days was a number that had work in it, which was the only kind of number Clara found useful anymore. The next morning she went to see Dunore. He received her in the front room of his property office, which doubled as the waiting area for his insurance work, and his land brokerage, and whatever else he did that kept him in the same gray coat through all seasons. He was already seated when she arrived, which meant he had seen her coming through the window and arranged himself in advance. He was that kind of man. She told him she would be vacating the room in 9 days. He nodded as if he had expected this, which she suspected he had. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a folded document and set it on the table between them. An offer. Handwritten, dated that morning for the purchase of the Caldwell Ridge land deed. $35 plus the forgiveness of her outstanding rent debt plus the right to remain in the current room through December. She did not pick up the document. She looked at it from where she sat. That's a fair price for useless land, she said. It is. His voice was even the voice of a man making a business case rather than a personal one, which made it more persuasive and also more suspicious. It's actually generous for land that won't farm and won't develop. Then why do you want it? The pause was less than a second, but it was there. She had learned to measure pauses around Dunore the way Thomas had measured gradients. Small differences carried large meaning. I buy land throughout the county, he said. That's my business. Not every purchase has a specific purpose at the time of purchase. Thomas surveyed that land in 1885. Something moved behind Dunore's eyes, too quick to name gone before she could hold it. Thomas surveyed half the county, he said. That's how he made his living. He made a particular note about Caldwell Ridge. She watched his face. A specific observation about the land itself. Surveyors make notes. That's what they do. Yes, Clara said, it is. She stood up. She left the offer on the table. At the door, she stopped and turned back, not because she had anything further to say, but because she wanted to see his face when she said it. I'll let you know my decision before we leave. Outside, the September air had a quality she associated with the last days of warmth before the cold locked in a certain transparency, as if the light was showing you things more clearly than it would bother to in any other season. She walked back along the main street of Harland Creek with the deed in her coat pocket and Thomas's observation moving through her mind like a current finding its direction. Warm air discharge. Steady. Dunore knew something about that land. She did not know yet what he knew or what it meant or whether it was enough to matter. But the pause had been real and the offer had been ready too fast, and $35 for land that was genuinely worthless was not the way Elias Dunore conducted business. She spent the afternoon selling what remained. The table went to the widow Cressman down the lane, who gave her $4 and a jar of pickled green beans that Clara accepted because refusing food was a luxury. The 3 remaining chairs went to the hardware merchant for $2 total, which was less than they were worth, but more than nothing. The small wardrobe with the broken hinge went to the family in the building at the end of the block for $1.50, and the iron frame mirror, the one Thomas had given her on their first anniversary, carried carefully all the way from his mother's house in Grafton, she placed into the arms of a woman she did not know who happened to be passing, and who stared at it with the expression of someone encountering something beautiful in an unexpected place. Clara had stopped walking with it in front of her. She had stood on the street with the mirror in both hands and looked at herself in the glass for what she understood would be the last time for a considerable while, a woman of 38 in a gray dress that had been washed too many times with a particular arrangement of features that Thomas had called handsome, and that she had always thought of simply as functional, a face that held up to work the same way good boots held up to miles. She looked at herself for 3 seconds. Then she put the mirror into the passing woman's hands and walked on before the woman could think to offer money. She bought in order the 2-man crosscut saw and a long-handled axe from Calhoun's smithing supply, which cost more than she wanted, but which she refused to economize on because a bad tool in difficult conditions was not an economy but a liability. 2 wool blankets, heavy grade, the kind sold to mining crews, not the kind sold to households. 20 pounds of seed potatoes, dried peas and cornmeal and salt pork and a cloth sack of salt. 60 feet of rope in 2 coils. 2 gallons of kerosene and a supply of wicks, a pound of cut nails in a paper bag, 1 laying hen in a wicker cage selected from the back of a farmer's cart on the basis that she was the calmest of the available options, and calm, in Clara's estimation, was an undervalued quality in any living creature. She kept Thomas's tools. She kept the notebook. She kept the deed. Nora packed the handcart that evening with the systematic intelligence that had become her primary characteristic over the past year. Not just loading it, but loading it correctly. Weight distribution, considered fragile things, braced the wicker cage wedged in the back corner where it would not tip. She did this without being told how and without asking questions, which was either the most useful or the most heartbreaking thing about Nora at 14, and sometimes Clara could not decide which. Sam packed his own small bundle, a change of clothes, the 3 river stones he had collected over the summer, and assigned particular significance, and the small brass compass that had been in Thomas's kit and that Sam had been carrying in his pocket since the funeral, as if the needle might point towards something the rest of them couldn't see. Clara did not ask him to leave it behind. The night before they left, after the children were asleep on the pile of blankets that had replaced the beds she'd sold, Clara sat at the floor where the table had been and spread the deed and the notebook and the surveying tools out around her in the lamplight. She studied the topo sketch Thomas had made of the ridge, the kind of quick field drawing he made before the form of survey, just enough to hold the shape of the land in memory. The cave opening was marked with his symbol for significant geological feature, a circle with a line through it like a 0 that had been canceled and then reconsidered. She traced the line with her finger. He had stood there. He had felt the warm air come out of the dark, and he had stood perfectly still and measured it and written it down and thought worth returning to. And then the years had moved the way years do, full of other contracts and other ridge lines, and the ordinary accumulation of a life in Caldwell Ridge had remained in the notebook on page 47, while Thomas's actual body was somewhere in Tucker County, in ground that had been filled over and seeded with grass by the mining company's grounds crew, as if the earth could simply be asked to forget what had happened. She did not let herself stay in that thought. She had learned over 14 months to visit it briefly and leave before it became residence. What she let herself stay in was the practicality of page 47. Limestone karst formation at 2,400 feet in elevation. Geothermal discharge, steady source, and subsurface water movement. Not documented. Unusual. Thomas had been precise. He did not write unusual about things that were merely notable. He wrote it about things that didn't fit the expected pattern, and in 11 years of surveying the Appalachian counties, he had seen every expected pattern at least twice. Whatever he had found at Caldwell Ridge had been genuinely outside his experience, which was the kind of thing that made the hair rise on the back of Clara's neck, not with fear, but with the particular alertness of someone who has just found a door in a wall they thought was solid. A geothermal vent inside a limestone cave at 2,400 feet. She thought about what that meant in practical terms. She thought about it the way she thought about the cornmeal and the peas and the placement of weight on the handcart as a problem with physical properties that could be worked with if you understood them correctly. Limestone held heat. Karst systems moved water and air. A thermal vent meant temperature differential inside warmer than outside, regardless of season. The deeper inside, the more stable. She thought if it was real and if the vent was as steady as Thomas had written, then the cave on Caldwell Ridge was not a cave. It was a structure that had been sitting there waiting for someone to understand what it actually was. She thought about the winter coming down through these walls, like water through a sponge. She thought about the $4 she would never find in this room. She blew out the lamp and lay down beside her children and stared at the ceiling she could not see and thought we'd leave before dawn. She did not sleep much, but the thinking she did in those dark hours was the productive kind, the kind that moves forward rather than circling, that takes the shape of the problem and turns it over until it becomes the shape of a plan. In the morning, she dressed in the dark and woke the children quietly, and they ate the last of the cornbread cold, standing without ceremony, because there was no furniture left to sit at. Sam wrapped his stones and his compass in his shirt and tucked the bundle under his arm. Nora pulled the handcart from the corner and checked the rope ties on the load with both hands before nodding to herself. The hen clucked once from the wicker cage, then went quiet, as if she too understood that the time for that kind of noise was not now. Clara locked the door of the room and left the key on the step. She did not look at the building again. The main street of Harland Creek was not empty at that hour because a town built on extraction work never fully slept. There were always men moving toward shifts, women starting bread, animals being led to water. The sky was the particular deep blue that comes just before the first light, and the temperature had dropped overnight into the low 40s, the breath of every living thing visible as small white ghosts. Bert Calhoun was already at the door of his smithing shop, the forge behind him beginning to orange. He saw Clara and her children in the loaded cart and the hen in the cage, and the expression on his face was the one she had been expecting, a complex mixture in which contempt was the loudest note. "Going to live in a cave like animals, are you? That ridge will bury all three of you before Christmas." She walked past him without stopping. Not because she had nothing to say, but because there was nothing to say that would cost her less than her silence. The Reverend's wife watched from the parlor window with the expression of a woman watching a disaster she had predicted, but not prevented, something between vindication and sorrow that Clara found more exhausting than the open mockery. Dr. Marsh stood at the corner of the street in his coat and hat, a black bag at his feet, as if he had been on his way somewhere and stopped. His face was different from the others, not contemptuous, not satisfied, but watchful in a way that Clara had always respected about Owen Marsh, he observed before he concluded. He watched the three of them pass, and his eyes went to the handcart, and then to Nora, and then to Clara, and what she saw in his face in that moment was not pity, but the particular expression of a careful man who was revising his estimate of something. She gave him a single nod, and Dunmore. He was standing on the porch of his property office, in the gray-gloved hands in his pockets, as still as a man who has decided to let a situation develop rather than force it. He waited until Clara was within 10 feet of him before he spoke, pitched low for her alone. "The offer stays open when you come back." She did not stop. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and said nothing because answering him would have implied uncertainty, and she had decided in the dark before dawn that whatever she was carrying up that mountain, uncertainty, was not part of the load. Nora pulled the handcart over the first stretch of rutted road with both hands on the crossbar, her knuckles white against the worn wood, her face forward and steady. Sam walked at Clara's side, his small hand finding the edge of her coat and holding it not from fear, she knew, but from the need to stay connected to something solid while the world rearranged itself around him. The hen moved quietly in her cage, settling into the rhythm of the cart. Behind them, Harland Creek went about its morning. Ahead, the trail climbed into the pine and the birch and the cold that lived above everything else, and somewhere 2.5 days up that trail, there was a dark place in a limestone ridge where warm air moved through the stone like breathing, and a circle on a page that a man she loved had drawn with his own hand and labeled significant, and then not lived long enough to return to. She walked toward it with everything she had left, which was considerable, and everything she had lost, which she carried differently now, not as weight, but as direction. The light came over the eastern ridge as they reached the edge of town, and it fell across the road ahead of them in long gold bars, the kind of light that doesn't last, that only exists in that particular minute between darkness and the ordinary morning, and Clara walked through it without slowing down. The first day on the trail was the kind of hard that had a bottom to it, the predictable hard of weight and elevation and uneven ground, the kind of difficulty that does not surprise you, but simply asks you to keep meeting it. Clara had walked difficult terrain before in her years growing up on the farm in western Pennsylvania, where her father's land ran up against the first real ridges of the Alleghenies, and she had learned then what she confirmed. Now the body complains loudest in the first 2 hours, and after that it either adapts or it doesn't, and hers always had. The trail out of Harland Creek followed the creek bed north for the first 3 miles before breaking east and beginning the serious climb. Clara had borrowed a copy of the county map from Dr. Marsh's office 2 days prior. He had not asked why, which was one of the reasons she had always trusted Owen Marsh, and she had cross-referenced it with Thomas's field sketch until she had the route memorized well enough to carry it in her head rather than her hands. Thomas had surveyed this trail 2 years back, and his notations ran along the margin of the sketch in their familiar shorthand grade percentages, footing quality water sources, shelter potential at particular bends. She heard his voice in each notation the way she heard a teacher's voice when she opened a book she had studied carefully, not as haunting, but as instruction. Nora pulled the cart over the creek crossing on a series of flat stones Thomas had noted as reliable, and they were the surface worn smooth by years of boots, but still solid, still holding. Sam went across first at his mother's instruction, arms out for balance, moving with the careful deliberateness of a boy who had been told once about the current and had filed it away permanently. The hen made a sound in her cage that was less a click than a comment, and Sam spoke back to her in a low, companionable murmur that Clara could not quite hear, but did not need to. By mid-morning, the creek was behind them, and the trail was climbing in earnest, the grade enough that the handcart required 2 people on the crossbar at the steeper stretches, Clara and Nora leaning into it with their shoulders, while Sam moved to the back and pushed with both hands against the frame, his boots finding grip in the frozen mud. They spoke very little. The work was the conversation. The trees changed as they gained elevation. The soft maples and oaks of the valley floor, giving way first to hickory and then to the white pine that came in thick on the upper ridges, blocking the sky and panels, and filling the air with a cold, clean smell that Clara associated permanently with effort and height. Under the pines, the ground was layered with needles compressed into a mat that absorbed sound and footfall equally, and for long stretches the only noise was their own breathing and the rhythmic protest of the cart wheels on the uneven ground, and occasionally the hens running commentary on the proceedings. They stopped twice before noon once at a flat rock shelf where Clara spread the last of the cornbread and the salt pork, and they ate standing up, looking out over the valley floor below them, Harland Creek visible as a gray smear of rooftops and smoke through the pine canopy, and once at a spring that Thomas had marked as reliable, where they filled both water jugs, and Sam splashed his face and came up gasping at the cold in a way that made Nora almost smile. "How much further?" Sam asked, not with complaint, just with the data-gathering instinct he applied to most things. Clara pointed up the trail to where it bent around a limestone outcropping and disappeared. Past that bend, it levels out for about a mile, then climbs again. "We stop when we find the shelter spot your father marked." "What kind of shelter?" "A rock overhang above a dry stream bed. He said it faced south, which means the worst wind passes over it." She looked at him. "He camped there once when a survey ran long in October. He said it was cold but manageable." Sam considered this with the seriousness he gave to all logistical information. Was he alone? He was. He didn't mind being alone in the dark up here. Your father, Clara said, was the least frightened person in any room he was ever in, including rooms that were forests. Sam absorbed this. Then he picked up his bundle and his compass and fell back into step beside her without further comment, and she recognized in that small movement something she was going to need him to keep doing it all winter, the willingness to take information in and let it settle and move on. The south-facing overhang was where Thomas had marked it 2 hours past the spring, tucked into the ridge face in the way that a scar is tucked into skin, permanent, unremarkable, exactly the shape of its origin. The ground beneath was dry, as promised, the rock above extending far enough to have kept decades of rain from reaching it. Clara built a fire in the shallow depression that someone before Thomas had ringed with stones for exactly this purpose. The stones were blackened with old use. She fed the hen a handful of grain from the small cloth bag packed for this purpose, and told Sam to keep the cage sheltered close to the fire, and Sam constructed a small windbreak of leaning branches around the barn with the focused seriousness of an engineer addressing a structural problem, and the hens settled into it with the pragmatic acceptance of a creature that has outsourced its decisions about location to someone else. Nora had the blankets out and the food redistributed into smaller carry bags before Clara asked her to reorganizing the load for the next day's terrain, which included the steepest section of the climb. She worked with a lantern hooked on a branch stub above her, its light casting her shadow large and steady across the rock overhang, and Clara watched her from across the fire and thought not for the first time that she had produced someone entirely distinct from herself, quieter, more internally ordered, with a precision of movement that was Thomas's gift rather than her own. Nora was going to be someone, which was a thought Clara allowed herself to have for exactly 3 seconds before the fire needed tending, and the thought was set aside for the larger project of keeping everyone alive. They slept close together under the rock with the blankets arranged to hold heat, and the fire burned down to embers that glowed orange in the dark like something considering whether to continue, and the trees above them moved in a wind they could hear but not feel, and Clara lay awake for the first part of the night doing what she had been doing for months, running the calculations of survival forward in time until they hit something solid enough to stand on. The cave, if it was what Thomas had written that it was, could be a shelter. Not just a place to sleep, but a structure with a property, the property of warmth, where there should be cold, that changed the calculus of everything. She had been turning this over since she first read page 47 again 2 nights ago, and the more she turned it, the more it held its shape. A limestone cave with a steady thermal vent maintained a base temperature significantly above the outside air. She did not know the exact differential, but Thomas had written 52 degrees Fahrenheit in October, and if that held through winter, it meant the interior of the cave would be warmer than any room she could rent in Harland Creek, with the money she did not have. It meant the difference between survival that exhausted everything you had and survival that left something over. Something over. She had not had anything over in 14 months. She thought about the garden then for the first time as a real plan rather than a possibility, raised beds along the cave wall warmed by the earth itself growing through a winter that would kill anything planted in open ground. Kale could grow in low light, root vegetables needed almost none. Potatoes were the most reliable crop she knew, planted deep and left to work without much interference, which appealed to her on practical grounds and also tonight on temperamental ones. She slept eventually with the embers still faint and the wind moving above her and the compass in Sam's pocket pointing wherever it pointed. The second day was harder and better simultaneously, which was a combination Clara associated with progress. Harder because the trail above the overhang climbed without relief for the first 4 hours, the grade steep enough that the handcart became a 2-person project at every switchback, Nora on the crossbar pulling, and Clara behind with both hands against the frame, pushing while Sam served as the verbal warning system for rocks and roots. Root left, big root left. He had appointed himself to this function without being asked and was thorough about it, which saved them 2 near tips before noon. Better because the elevation was doing something to the air that Clara had not quite expected, even though Thomas had described it. At 1,800 feet, the pine canopy opened on the south-facing slopes, and the light came in at a different angle, and everything the light touched the ice in the stream bed, the frost crystals on the dark pine needles, the pale limestone faces of the outcropping rocks, threw it back with a clarity that felt like being inside something very clean. She had grown up in the mountains in a general sense, but she had not been this high for years, and the altitude had a quality to it that was less like weather and more like a change in the nature of attention. Everything up here was more specifically itself. They stopped for water at a narrow seep where groundwater bled out of the limestone face in a thin silver line and dropped into a frozen pool 3 feet below, and Sam lay on his stomach at the edge and broke the ice carefully with a stick and filled the jug. Clara watched him do it and thought he is going to be fine. This was not a conclusion she arrived at often about her son, not because she doubted him, but because 8 years old in any circumstance required ongoing vigilance. But watching him break ice at the edge of a mountain stream with the methodical care of a person who understands what he's doing, she arrived at it clearly. "Mum," Sam said, not looking up from the jug. "Yes, the ground is warm here." She went to him. He was right. The moss surrounding the seep, a radius of about 2 feet, was green and soft rather than frozen. And when Clara pressed her palm flat against it, she felt the same thing she had felt pressing her hand to the page in Thomas's notebook, reading his description of the thermal vent recognition. Not discovery, because the fact had been there before her. Recognition, the meeting of something known with something felt. The water comes from underground, she said. The rock is holding heat. From what? From the earth. She looked up the slope, calculating. They were still half a mile from the marked position of the cave. The same source that heats the cave we're looking for. Sam sat back on his heels and looked at the green moss with the expression he used for things he was filing away permanently. The earth is warm inside, he said. It was not a question. In certain places, she said. This is one of them. They found the cave in the late afternoon of the second evening, as the light was going gold and thin through the western trees, and the shadows on the ridge face were starting to lengthen into the particular blue of early mountain dark. It was exactly where Thomas's sketch placed it, the eastern face of the ridge, between two limestone boulders that leaned toward each other, like old men sharing a confidence, their faces pale gray against the darker surrounding rock. The entrance was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, narrowing toward the top. Snow lay along the top edge of the boulders, but not on the ground in front of the opening. The warmer air escaping from the interior prevented accumulation. Clara noted this the way she had been trained to note things by years of listening to Thomas describe what the land was telling him. Look at where the expected thing is absent, because absence is data too. She lit the candle she had been carrying in her coat pocket, cupping her hand around the flame against the outside air, and stepped through the entrance. The dark closed around her immediately in the total way that underground. Dark does not like the absence of light, but like the presence of something else, a different quality of space, denser and more complete. The candle pushed a small circle of illumination, maybe 6 feet in every direction, and no further. She took 12 steps forward, counting, then stopped. She held her palm out flat in front of her. The warmth came from somewhere deeper in the rock, moving through the dark air, as surely as a hand reaching toward her. Not hot, not even particularly warm in absolute terms, but warm, relative to everything she had just walked through, consistent and without variation, like breath held steady, rather than the fitful exhale of a fire. She lowered the candle and watched the flame angle toward the cave entrance, away from the interior, which told her the warmer internal air was displacing the cooler air outward. Convection. Thomas's observation confirmed. She kept moving forward, counting steps until she reached the back wall of the main chamber. 38 steps from the entrance. She stretched her arms sideways in both directions, and neither arm reached the walls, which meant the chamber was wider than 12 feet wider, she would discover when she ran the measuring tape, than she had dared calculate for. The floor beneath her boots was firm, dry sand mixed with compressed earth, solid enough that her heel left only a slight depression rather than sinking. No standing water, no ice. The ceiling, when she raised the candle as high as she could reach, was high enough that she could not see it clearly. On the right side wall, roughly 10 feet from the back, the fissure. A vertical crack in the limestone, 6 feet long and perhaps 14 inches wide at its widest point, running floor to ceiling like a seam in fabric. From it, the warm air flowed with a consistency that was almost musical, a steady, inaudible note. She put her hand into the opening and felt the temperature climb noticeably. Down there, far below what she could see or know, the earth was doing what the earth did, holding its heat against the indifference of the sky above. Thomas had stood in this exact spot. He had put his hand into the same crack in the rock and felt the same thing she was feeling now, and he had taken out his notebook and written it down with the precision that was his particular form of love. Not sentimental, but exacting, the love that says, this matters, and I will make certain it is not lost. Mum, Nora's voice from the entrance. Are you all right? Come in, Clara said. Both of you. They came in slowly, Nora carrying the second candle, and Sam's hand in hers, and they stood in the small, overlapping circles of their two lights and looked at the space around them, its height, its width, its dry, undisturbed floor, and Clara watched their faces while they looked. Nora was calculating, she could see it, the measurements translating automatically in her mind into practical dimensions. How much space, how many uses, what could be built here? Sam was doing something different. He was standing very still with his eyes wide and his hand released from his sister's and his head tilted back, trying to find the ceiling in the dark. and his face held the expression of someone who has just understood something that they did not have the words for yet, but that they knew they would spend a long time trying to find. Clara crossed the main chamber and put her hand flat against the fissure again. "This is why we came," she said, not as explanation, as establishment of fact, the way Thomas used to begin a surveying session, naming the thing they were there to find, so that everything after that was simply the work of confirming and measuring what was already known. She took out the measuring tape. The main chamber was 34 feet across at its widest and 46 feet deep. The ceiling at the center, measured by the technique Thomas had described in the notebook for estimating heights, without a ladder sound timing and calculation, was at least 15 feet, possibly more. The floor was solid throughout, except for a strip along the left wall where moisture seeped slightly from the rock above which she noted and moved past. The fissure in the right wall ran the full 6 feet she had estimated, and the air from it, measured by her hand's educated assessment, at least 10 degrees warmer than the ambient cave air, which was itself at least 15 degrees warmer than the outside air she had walked through to get here. She wrote all of this in the back of Thomas's notebook in the spare pages he had left blank after his last field entry. She used his shorthand because she had learned it, and because it was precise, and because there was something in using his shorthand that was not grief, but was adjacent to it, a conversation conducted in a language that only two people had ever shared, one of whom was underground in Tucker County. When she was done writing, she stood in the middle of the chamber with the measuring tape in one hand and the notebook in the other, and the candle on the floor between her feet, and she looked at the space the candle light had revealed and thought very simply, without drama or ceremony, "This will work." Outside the cave, the mountain dark had come down fully, and the temperature had dropped sharply, and the stars over the ridge were the cold, bright stars of high altitude. Numerous and indifferent, the kind that do not comfort you, but do remind you that you are small, and that being small is not the same as being without resource. Sam had built a fire near the cave entrance using the technique Clara had shown him, and its warmth reached back into the cave opening, just enough to take the edge off the first feet inside. Nora had unpacked the food and arranged the bedding. The hen was asleep. Clara sat at the edge of the firelight and looked down through the darkness toward the valley where Harland Creek lay invisible beneath its smoke, and its winter and its particular opinions about widows who walked off into the mountains with their children and a handcart. She thought about Dunore and his gray coat and his pre-prepared offer, and the pause, less than a second but real, when she had mentioned Thomas's notes. She thought about what a company from outside the county might want with 17 acres of rock and cave country that a card player had been willing to give away. Warm air discharge, steady, not documented in county records. Thomas had seen it clearly enough to write it down and mark it significant and intend to return. Whatever Dunore was moving toward, he had come to it by a slower path than Thomas. Perhaps he had seen the field report, perhaps he had spoken to someone who had, and he had moved on it with the confident patience of a man who believed the resource was waiting and the owner was desperate enough to sell cheap. He had calculated that a woman with $4 short of her rent and no visible options would take $35 for land she had never seen. He had been half right. She was exactly as desperate as he calculated. He had just miscalculated what she would do with desperation. Nora appeared beside her holding 2 cups of heated water, mixed with the dried herbs she had found growing at the edge of the trail, spearmint, and something darker and more medicinal that Nora had identified with the confidence of a girl who read everything her father wrote and had apparently also read whatever she could find in the small collection of agricultural and botanical texts that Dr. Marsh kept in his waiting room. Clara accepted the cup. "It's real," Nora said, not a question, checking her own reading of the situation against her mother's. "It's real. What Thomas wrote about it. All of it. The dimensions are larger than his sketch suggested. The temperature differential is significant." Clara looked at the fire. "We have more to work with than I hoped for." Nora wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked into the dark above the tree line. "He knew," she said. "He wrote it down so someone would know." Clara did not answer this immediately. She let it sit in the air between them because it was true, and it was also more than she had room for tonight. Tonight, the truth she needed was the practical one, the dimensions of the chamber, and the steadiness of the vent and the dryness of the floor. The rest could wait until she could hold it without breaking her concentration. In the morning, she said, we start measuring for the cabin. Nora nodded. She finished her cup and set it aside and lay down on the bedding she had arranged inside the cave entrance, where the earth's warmth met the fire's warmth in a band that was almost bearable. Sam was already asleep there, one hand around the compass. His face relaxed in a way it rarely was when he was awake, the vigilance completely gone, the 8-year-old face visible underneath the serious one. Clara remained at the fire a while longer. The mountain was quiet in the specific way that high places are quiet, not silent but deeply itself. The wind in the pines and the occasional crack of frost in the rock, and the small sounds of nocturnal things moving in the dark beyond the firelight, all of it part of the same continuous notation that Thomas had spent years learning to read. She had not been afraid today. She had been cold and tired, and the work had been hard, and the mountain had not made anything easy for them, and she had not been afraid. She noted this the way she noted the temperature of the air in the cave, the way she noted the steadiness of the thermal vent as a property of the terrain she was working, with something to factor into the calculation. She put the last piece of wood on the fire and went inside and lay down beside her children and pulled the blanket to her chin and looked up at the darkness above her, the limestone ceiling. She could not see the earth above the limestone, the mountain above the earth, the cold sky above everything. Thomas had been here. His hand had pressed the same rock her hand had pressed. His eye had followed the same angle of warm air in the darkness. He had written worth returning to, and here she was, returning for him, and the warmth from the fissure moved through the chamber with the same steadiness it had moved through it when he measured it, and would move through it after everything she was about to build had run its full course and been replaced by whatever came next. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow the work began. The crosscut saw bit into the first pine tree at first light, and the sound it made, metal finding wood resistance, converting to progress, was the first sound on Caldwell Ridge that had not been made by wind or water or the settling of stone. Clara held the near handle, and Nora held the far one, and they found their rhythm inside the first minute, not by discussing it, but by the physical negotiation of two people sharing a task, each one learning the other's pull and compensating without instruction. The tree was 18 inches across at the base and straight as a surveyor's plumb line, which was why Clara had chosen it. She had walked the slope for 40 minutes before touching the saw to anything, selecting by the same criteria Thomas had used when picking reference trees for his surveys, not the most impressive specimen, but the most useful one, the one whose qualities served the actual need. The pine came down on her third attempt at the directional notch, falling exactly where she had planned it to fall, its crown crashing through the lower branches of two neighboring trees before it hit the ground with a concussion that Clara felt through the soles of her boots. Sap smell hit the cold air like something released from custody. Sam, stationed 20 feet back as she had instructed, let out a breath that had been held so long it came out as a sound. She did not stop to acknowledge the fallen tree. There were 11 more to cut before she had enough material for the cabin walls, and the days this far into September were already shorter than she needed them to be. The work of the first 2 weeks established a rhythm that restructured everything. Sleep hunger thought the movement of the sun across the ridge. They rose before the light was full and worked until it failed, and in between, there was the saw and the rope and the resistance of frozen ground and the particular education that comes only from doing something that cannot be practiced in advance. Clara had built outbuildings before on her father's farm in Pennsylvania, working alongside her father and her older brother on the crib barn and the root cellar. But that work had been guided and scaffolded, and she had been a participant rather than the architect. Here she was, every role simultaneously, and the errors were hers to catch before they became permanent. She made 3 decisions on the first day that proved right and 1 that proved wrong. The right one's building 6 feet inside the cave entrance, rather than at the entrance itself, which meant the cabin sat in the temperature gradient between the outside cold and the interior warmth, capturing both the thermal benefit and the natural insulation of the surrounding rock. Setting the corner posts in holes 18 inches deep, packed with the flat limestone fragments that lay everywhere on the cave floor, which gave a foundation solid enough that she never once felt the structure settle unevenly afterward. Orienting the single door toward the cave entrance rather than the thermal fissure, so that entering the cabin did not mean losing the warm air that had built up inside it. The wrong one was the roof pitch. She cut it too shallow on the first attempt, following a memory of the barn roof that had been designed for different snowfall at a lower elevation. The ridge got more snow than Harland Creek, and the weight of even a modest accumulation would eventually compress a shallow pitch into structural failure. She caught this on the third day after a night of thinking about load distribution, and she and Nora dismantled the partial roof structure and rebuilt it steeper, which cost a full day and a half but was not negotiable. A roof that failed in January was not a roof. Nora absorbed every decision Clara made or unmade and stored it with the comprehensive retention she applied to everything she deemed worth keeping. By the end of the first week, the girl could look at a section of wall and identify which log needed shimming before Clara pointed to it. By the end of the second week, she was solving small structural problems, independently realizing that the gap between two logs on the north wall needed not just moss and clay, but a thin wedge of cedar to hold the packing in place through the freeze-thaw cycles that would come with the temperature differential between inside and outside. She had figured this out by watching ice form and melt on the rock near the cave entrance over 3 consecutive mornings, and she said nothing about it until she had already cut the wedge and placed it and confirmed it held. Sam's work was not smaller because he was smaller. It was differently scaled, calibrated to what 8 years could reliably accomplish, gathering deadfall for kindling in bundles that he stacked at the left side of the cave entrance, with a consistency of size and placement that made them immediately useful rather than merely present. Carrying the flat limestone fragments that served as floor leveling, material load after small load, establishing the pathway between the rockfall field 20 yards east of the cave and the construction site with the thoroughness of someone who had understood without being told that many small contributions made the same sum as fewer large ones. He kept the fire going at the camp end of the cave through the working hours, which meant when they stopped at dusk, there was warmth to return to and water already heating. And this was not nothing. This was on certain evenings the difference between stopping gracefully and stopping at the edge of something worse. The cabin walls were complete by the 14th day of October, ahead of what Clara had planned for and behind what she had hoped for, which was the precise definition of acceptable. The timbered walls stood 6 feet high inside the cave, locked together at the corners, with the notch joints she had measured and cut at night by lamplight, after the children were asleep checking Thomas's notes on standard timber framing that he had recorded during a survey of a mill construction near Petersburg in 1883. He had drawn the joint diagrams with the care of someone who understood that information outlasts the person who gathered it, and she had been grateful for those diagrams in the specific way you are grateful for things that arrive exactly when they are needed. The ceiling was cedar shingles, split from a fallen log they had found on the east slope, already downed, already beginning to check along the grain in the way that seasoned wood does, which made splitting cleaner. Nora had done most of the splitting once Clara showed her the angle working with the hatchet in long, efficient sessions while Clara fitted the log walls above, and the sound of the splitting, the clean crack of grain separating from grain, had become part of the rhythm of the ridge, the way the saw had been in the first weeks, a sound that meant the work was proceeding. The iron stove was the one item Clara had not been able to carry on the handcart and had instead arranged to have brought up in pieces by the young son of the hardware merchant who had charged her $3 for the service and who had not asked why she wanted it delivered to the limestone ridge above the valley and had not made eye contact when she thanked him, which told her the story of her departure from Harland Creek had already been discussed at length by people who had not been present for it. She fitted the stovepipe through the natural chimney shaft in the rock above the cabin, a vertical fissure that Thomas had noted in his sketch as a probable gas escape channel, which meant it drafted correctly without modification, and when she lit the first fire and the smoke rose clean and straight up through the limestone and disappeared, she allowed herself the luxury of standing still for 30 seconds and watching it. 30 seconds was enough. Then she fed another piece of wood into the fire and went to check the roof seam above the north wall. They had been sleeping in the cave since their arrival, first near the entrance fire, and then progressively further inside as the cabin took shape and the interior temperature became a known quantity rather than a hope. By the time the stove was operational, the cabin held at what Clara estimated, based on the feel of skin against air, to be somewhere between 48 and 54 degrees even, on the nights when the outside air dropped below 20. The thermal fissure in the right side cave wall was doing exactly what Thomas's notation had predicted. The word steady had been the most important word in that entry, she understood now, more important than the temperature measurement itself, because steadiness was what made the rest possible. A heat source that fluctuated was a risk that had to be managed. A heat source that simply continued was a foundation. She built the first garden bed on the first day of November. The design was straightforward, split log frames 12 inches high, set along the left cave wall in a row of 6 each frame, 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. The soil was the challenge. The cave floor itself was too sandy and too compacted to support root vegetables without amendment, and the topsoil from the immediate surroundings of the cave was thin mountain soil adequate for native plants adapted to it, and poor for the dense production she needed. Thomas's notes from a survey near a river bottom in Highland County described a particular alluvial deposit-rich dark soil laid down by repeated flooding, deep and loose and full of organic material, and she found its equivalent at the bend of a small stream 3/4 of a mile below the cave, where decades of mountain water had deposited exactly what she needed. The distance and the terrain made every trip a significant undertaking, but the soil itself was light for its volume, and Clara and Nora established a 2-person carry system using a frame she built from 2 poles and a section of rope, a kind of stretcher for soil bags that allowed them to bring 40 pounds per trip without the backload that single carry would have required. 16 trips over 4 days. They did not count the trips while doing them because counting made the number large. They counted afterward when the beds were full and the soil was level, and what had been an empty rock floor now looked like something planted, something intended, something that had a future in it. The seed potatoes went in first cut to sections with at least 1 eye each, placed 4 inches deep in the loose dark soil, and covered with the rye straw that she had bought in Harland Creek and compressed into a bundle on the handcart. Kale seeds next in 2 of the rear beds, cold hardy and productive in low light, 2 qualities that matched the available conditions more precisely than almost anything else she could have chosen. Turnips in the last 2 beds because they grew fast and kept long, and the tops were as edible as the roots, which made them twice as efficient per square foot of bed space. The lantern above the beds burned through the night hours, extending the available light past what the cave entrance admitted during the increasingly short November days. She had calculated the kerosene consumption against her supply and found she had enough for 60 nights at the current burn rate, which took her to late December, after which she would need to reduce hours or resupply, and resupply meant going down the mountain in winter conditions, which was a variable she was not yet ready to plan around. It was on the 6th day of November that she met Ezra Hollis. She had gone down to the stream below the cave to break ice and fill the water jugs, which had become the morning task because the small internal seep produced enough water for cooking and minimal washing, but not enough for the garden beds during dry spells. The old man was standing at the stream bend on the far bank watching 3 sheep drink from the unfrozen center channel where the current prevented ice formation. He was somewhere past 70, with the particular construction of men who have done physical work their whole lives thinner than they were, but not diminished, the frame still evident under the reduction. He watched her break ice with the hatchet without comment until she had both jugs filled and capped, and then he spoke across the 10 feet of water between them. "You're the woman living in the cave up on the limestone face." She straightened up. "I am." He looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who has been wrong about people before and has made a practice of looking carefully to avoid it. "My name's Ezra Hollis. I've got a farm at the bottom of this drainage 2 miles south. I've been trying to figure out how to feed these 3 through winter, and I can't." He looked at the sheep who had finished drinking and were now investigating the bank with the systematic hopefulness of their kind. "I'm going to have to sell them or slaughter them, and I'd rather sell." "What are you asking for them?" He named a price that was fair for the season and the condition of the animals, not cheap, because Ezra Hollis was not a man who disguised need as generosity, but not inflated either because he was not that kind of man either. Clara looked at the 3 sheep who looked back at her with the mild, non-committal expression of animals who have not yet decided whether to be interested. The largest one, a gray-faced ewe with a slightly officious bearing, met her eyes with what she interpreted, fairly or not, as some form of assessment. She told Hollis she would take them, and they agreed on a date for the transfer, and then, because he was still standing there with the ease of a man who was not in a hurry, and because she found herself, after weeks of speaking only to her children, with a small surplus of sentences available, she asked him about the plants along the stream bank, which ones were still useful at this time of year, which ones had medicinal properties she should know about for the winter ahead. Hollis looked at her for a moment, Then he crossed the stream on the stepping stones with the practiced ease of a man who had done it thousands of times and stood beside her and began to point. He spent an hour with her on the bank. Willow bark for fever dried and stored in a cloth bag. Wild ginger root for stomach illness, identifiable by the kidney-shaped leaves that persisted under snow. The dark berries on the low shrub at the edge of the tree line that looked edible and were not a distinction he communicated with the economical seriousness of someone who has seen the consequences of getting it wrong. A particular moss that grew on the north faces of the limestone outcroppings that had drawing properties for infection if applied as a poultice. Before he left, leading his sheep back toward the path that would take them to his farm, until the agreed transfer date, he stopped and turned back. The largest sheep had paused at the bend in the bank and was looking back toward the limestone ridge above them as if she had already decided something. "That one," Hollis said, nodding at her, "is Ida. She knows this drainage better than I do. She was born up near that ridge. Actually, one of her first owners ran sheep on the upper slope years back before the soil gave out. If you ever get turned around in the snow, or the children need to find their way home from somewhere on this mountain, turn her loose. She'll go home." He paused. "Wherever she considers home to be at that point." Clara considered this information and stored it without comment, the way Thomas had stored the details of the terrain he surveyed, not because he expected to need them, but because the land offered information only once, and the wise response was to receive it without waiting to know the application. The sheep arrived 4 days later. Ida walked into the cave without hesitation, as Hollis had implied she would, and investigated the space with the thoroughness of a new employee, familiarizing herself with the premises. The other two followed her lead after a moment's conferral at the entrance. Clara had built the pen from split rails along the cave's south wall opposite the garden beds, and the three animals settled into it the same evening with the pragmatic ease of creatures who have decided that stone walls and warm air represent an acceptable improvement over open ground in November. The cave had acquired a sound now that it had not had before: the low, intermittent sounds of sheep at rest, the soft percussion of hooves on stone, the occasional ruminative breath in the dark, and this sound changed the space in a way that Clara had not anticipated and could not fully account for. The cave had been a structure. Now it was a place that contained living things other than her family, and that distinction had weight in it, the particular weight of responsibility that is also, when you look at it from a certain angle, the weight of something to protect. The garden beds were showing green by the second week of November. Kale first, the leaves emerging from the dark soil with the force that characterizes plants that have evolved for cold, pushing up with a directness that had nothing tentative in it. Then the turnip tops, feathery at first, and then broader, anchoring themselves above the swelling roots below. The potatoes were slower and less visible, their progress happening underground. But when Clara pressed her fingers into the straw and found the developing stems and felt the first small tuber forming on one of them, she had a sensation she recognized from her first years of farming with her father. Not pride exactly, because pride required an audience, and she was alone at the garden bed at the time, but its private equivalent, the knowledge that a thing you did with your hands is working. She had been writing in the back of Thomas's notebook since they arrived in the blank pages he had left, keeping the same kind of records he had kept: temperatures, plant growth, rates, sheep condition, rainfall and snowfall, amounts estimated by the depth at the cave entrance, the level of the stream. Not because she had been asked to or expected to show it to anyone, but because the habit of recording made the information permanent rather than merely experienced. And she was beginning to understand that what they were doing on this ridge was the kind of thing that had value beyond its immediate survival purpose. That the information she was gathering about geothermal warmed cave agriculture in an Appalachian winter was information that did not exist anywhere because no one had done this before. At least not this way, not with this intention. Thomas had known it was unusual. He had written that word because it was the precise one. She was the one who was going to find out what unusual could become. The middle of November brought the first serious cold, the kind that announced itself not gradually, but as a single overnight transition. The temperature dropping from the low 30s into the low teens between dusk and midnight, and staying there when the sun came up, as if it had always been that number, and the previous warmth had been the aberration. Inside the cabin, the stove managed the temperature adequately when fueled consistently, but the fuel question was the permanent background concern of every morning. The firewood stack needed to be maintained, which meant the deadfall collection Sam had been doing needed to expand, which meant Clara needed to spend 2 afternoons a week on active woodcutting to supplement what could be gathered without tools. She did this without particular complaint because complaint did not cut wood, but she noted in her records the hours spent on firewood maintenance versus the hours available for construction and garden work, and the ratio was less comfortable than she wanted it to be. There were not enough hours in the short winter days for everything that needed doing, which was not a new problem in human history, but was a new problem in her personal accounting, and she solved it the way she had always solved resource scarcity, by being very precise about what to prioritize. Food production, non-negotiable. Shelter integrity, non-negotiable. Heat, non-negotiable. Everything else was negotiable, which in practical terms meant that Nora's formal lessons stopped for 3 weeks, while Nora herself became a full working partner in firewood management, that certain repairs to the cabin exterior waited for milder days, and that the expansion of the sheep pen to accommodate the lambs she expected in early spring was planned in detail, but not yet built. Nora did not object to the suspension of lessons because Nora was not a child who objected to necessity. But Clara saw her reading the surveying notebook in the evenings by lamplight, working through the mathematical sections with the self-directed focus of someone who has identified what she needs and has decided to get it without external scaffolding, and the image of her daughter bent over that notebook in the warm lamplight of the cabin, with the sheep breathing in the cave behind her, and the mountain winter locked outside the rock walls, was one of the images Clara returned to when she needed to remember why she was doing the specific thing she was doing rather than some other thing. It was during one of these evenings in the last week of November that Nora looked up from the notebook and spoke. "Papa wrote about this place for 2 years before he died. There are 3 other entries about this ridge earlier in the book. I found them." Clara turned from the stove. "Show me." The other entries were brief survey notations from 1883 and 1884 for the detailed 1885 entries she had built her plan around. The 1883 one described the general limestone formation and flagged it for future survey. The 1884 one recorded a second visit to the eastern face and the observation of warm air from a narrower opening that Thomas had been unable to enter at that time. The 1885 entry was the full survey, the one on page 47. He had been returning to this ridge for 2 years before he wrote worth returning to, which meant he had been building toward that conclusion, over time accumulating observations until the weight of evidence produced the statement. He had not told her because it had not yet become a plan. It had been a question, and Thomas kept his questions internal until they were ready to be something more definite. She knew this about him. She had always known it. He was thorough, she said. He was patient, Nora said, which was not the same thing, and which Nora had clearly recognized was not the same thing. He didn't rush to the answer. Clara looked at her daughter for a moment. "Neither will you." The first indication that Dunore had sent someone to the ridge came on a gray morning in the lost days of November. She had gone out before full light to the woodlot east of the cave, where a deadfall hickory was providing the best fuel of the season, making the most of the hour before the temperature made prolonged outside work impractical. She was 40 yards from the cave entrance, her axe in hand, when she heard a sound on the lower trail that was not the sound of the mountain footsteps, deliberate and directional, the sound of someone who knows where they are going. She did not move. She stood in the thin cover of the young pines at the woodlot edge and waited. 2 men appeared on the trail that switched back below the cave entrance, coming from the valley direction. They stopped when they had line of sight to the cave 200 yards or so below, where she stood, and one of them opened a document case and produced what looked like a map or plan, and they conferred over it for several minutes with the professional manner of men conducting a site assessment rather than a casual visit. The other man was writing in a small notebook. He wrote for a while, then he looked up and surveyed the ridge face with a particular systematic scanning of someone taking visual inventory. The first man was not someone she recognized. He wore city clothes that were wrong for the terrain, a wool overcoat designed for Pittsburgh streets rather than mountain slopes, and he held the document case with the careful attention of someone for whom the contents were valuable. The second man was Elias Dunmore. She recognized the gray coat from 200 yards away without any uncertainty. She remained where she was and did not reveal herself. This was instinct, not calculation, but the instinct was sound. She had no information, and Dunmore had information she did not have. And the gap between their respective knowledge was not a negotiating position she was prepared to enter from this side. She watched them for 18 minutes by her internal estimate. They walked along the lower trail examining the ridge-faced Dunmore pointing at various features, while the other man wrote. Then they descended back toward the valley without approaching the cave. She went back inside and sat on the cabin floor with the deed and the notebook and the surveying tools spread around her, and thought about what Dunmore knew and how he knew it and what he intended to do with it, and the answers she arrived at were not reassuring. He had access to Thomas's field reports. The county surveyor's records were public documents available at the courthouse in Franklin, and Thomas had filed a preliminary geological notation on Caldwell Ridge as a standard part of his contract work. The notation would not contain the full detail of the 1885 notebook entry, but it would contain enough unusual thermal feature, eastern cave face, potential geological significance to attract the attention of someone who was looking for exactly that kind of resource. The man in the city coat was not a buyer. He was an assessor, which meant Dunmore was not merely interested in the land, but was already in a process with a third party, already in the early stages of a transaction that required an on-site evaluation. The transaction would not complete without her signature on the deed, which meant Dunmore had not given up on persuading her to sell. He had simply decided that persuasion would be more effective if it came accompanied by evidence that others had confirmed the value of what he was asking her to give up. She was not afraid. But she was clear-eyed about the fact that clarity about a threat did not diminish the threat, and Dunmore had resources she did not have, and legal standing she did not have, and time on his side if he chose to use it patiently. What she had was the cave and the garden beds currently producing food in the heart of an Appalachian winter, and the thermal vent that had not varied by more than a few degrees since they arrived, and Thomas's notebook with its 3 years of observations and a deed that bore her name. She folded everything back up and put the notebook in the crate and went to check the kale. It was fine. The kale was in fact the most reliable thing on the ridge, and on difficult days she found a specific comfort in its consistent, uncomplicated progress. It grew because the conditions were right and because she had created the conditions deliberately, which was all you could ask of anything you were responsible for. December deepened. The thermometer of the outside air, which she measured by the behavior of water in an uncovered cup, left at the cave entrance each morning, told her the nights were reaching 10 degrees, 5 degrees on 2 occasions, something below zero based on the thickness of ice that had formed in less than 2 hours of exposure. Inside the cabin, the stove and the earth together held a temperature above 45 on the worst nights, and the garden beds set against the wall closest to the thermal fissure stayed warm enough for continuous growth. She started shearing the sheep in the 3rd week of December, taking wool in careful sections, rather than a full shearing, which was not the traditional approach, but suited the conditions she needed the animals to retain enough coat for warmth, while she extracted enough fiber to make the spinning worthwhile. The first yield was substantial, nearly 4 pounds of usable fiber from the 3 animals together, washed in the warm spring water that seeped from the cave wall and dried over the stovepipe in slow-hanging sections that perfumed the cabin with lanolin and the particular smell of cleaned wool which Clara associated with her grandmother's house, and the kind of winters that were hard but contained. Nora spun the fiber on the simple spindle Clara had fashioned from a stick and a carved whorl of limestone, not efficient but functional, and the resulting yarn was coarse but strong, and by the end of December she had enough to begin the first pair of heavy stockings, working by feel in the dim lamp hours, her fingers learning the stitch tension by repetition rather than instruction. Sam had taken over the garden bed monitoring as a formal responsibility. He checked each bed morning and evening, reported the status of each plant to Clara in the verbal shorthand they had developed. Kale East bed, 2-3, new leaves, no yellowing, and flagged any changes in soil moisture or plant appearance that fell outside the established pattern. He had done this for 3 weeks before Clara realized he had also begun testing the temperature of the soil with his hands at each check, comparing the beds by proximity to the thermal fissure, and that he had a theory which he had not yet shared with her about which beds were performing better and why. She asked him about it. The beds near the fissure side, he said, with the careful precision of a child presenting information he has verified before speaking, the soil is warmer, not just a little, a lot. And the plants in those beds are growing faster. He looked at her with his dark eyes serious. I think if we could move all the beds to that side, everything would grow faster. It was a correct observation and a sound hypothesis, and she told him so, which produced the expression she had come to think of as Sam's private version of satisfaction. Not a smile exactly, but a settling, a slight relaxation of the permanent watchfulness he carried. "We can't move them now," she said, "but next season when we redesign the layout, we'll do exactly that." He nodded. "I'll keep tracking." He would. She knew he would. He was Thomas in this way, the way of keeping track, of treating data as something worth caring for, of understanding that the record of a thing was part of the thing itself. The blizzard announced itself on a Monday morning in the second week of January with a change in the air pressure that Clara recognized not intellectually but physically, the sensation she associated with approaching weather at altitude, a kind of tightening in the atmosphere, like a room filling slowly with something invisible. By midday, the sky had closed to a uniform gray that had no source direction light coming from everywhere, equally which was the sky's way of saying the storm was overhead rather than approaching. She spent the intervening hours in systematic preparation, all available water jugs filled from the internal spring seep. Every armload of firewood that Sam and Nora could move brought inside and stacked in the back of the cave against the right wall. The sheep fed double their normal ration of the dry grass she had stockpiled. The garden beds checked and the straw mulch thickened. The cabin door reinforced with an additional cross brace of split timber wedged against the frame from the inside. The snow began in the mid-afternoon. At first, the ordinary snow of a mountain winter, flakes of normal size, falling with normal purpose, and then within 2 hours something different. The flakes became smaller and faster and more numerous, filling the visible air beyond the cave entrance with a density that reduced visibility to a few feet, and the wind that came with them was not the directional wind of ordinary storms, but the omnidirectional wind of a true blizzard, a wind that seemed to come from all 4 points simultaneously, that pushed snow against every exposed surface with equal pressure and didn't particularly care which direction was north. By evening, the cave entrance was a narrowing frame of white, the snow accumulating on the outer face of the boulders and beginning to encroach on the threshold. Clara built a small barrier of flat stones across the lower entrance to slow the drift, and by the time she had finished it, the outer world had disappeared entirely behind a moving white wall. The second day, the entrance was fully blocked. She dug through from the inside with the short-handled shovel she had fashioned from a split log, creating a narrow tunnel through the packed snow that admitted light and air and the sound of the storm still moving above them. The temperature outside by the ice cup method was somewhere below zero. Inside, the stove kept the cabin at 50 degrees through the night, and the thermal fissure added its contribution to the ambient cave temperature, and the sheep generated their own heat in the pen, and the total effect was a warmth that required management rather than maintenance. She damped the stove at night rather than running it full conserving wood. The third day, the kerosene ran low. She rationed it to 2 hours of lamplight in the evening, using the remaining hours in firelight that was adequate for the practical tasks of feeding and watering and wool work, but not for reading or writing. Nora continued to spin in the dimness by feel her fingers more capable than her eyes. By this point, the yarn building in slow, steady coils. Sam sat close to the stove and listened to the storm with the attentiveness of a navigator, listening to something the instruments weren't tracking, as if the storm had information in it that would be useful to know. The fourth morning, Sam woke with the fever. Clara knew before she touched his forehead. She saw it in the way he was lying, the slight rigidity that sick children acquire, the withdrawal of the body into itself as it redirects resources. She pressed her palm to his forehead and felt the elevated heat that was different from the ambient warmth of the cabin dryer and more insistent, and she remained completely still for 3 seconds while she cataloged what she had available. Willow bark dried, stored in the cloth bag. She had not used it yet and had half a pound of it enough. She had the warm water from the internal seep, which was cleaner than surface water, and at a temperature that would reduce the shock of a warm drink. She had the wool blankets. She had the knowledge of what to do, which was the most important thing, and also the hardest one. She made the willow bark tea by bringing the water just below boiling and steeping the bark for 15 minutes, then straining it through a section of cheesecloth into a tin cup. The resulting liquid was bitter and dark, and Sam made the face that medicine always produced in him, a full-body objection, and drank it anyway, which she had taught him in the same session she had taught him that the fire was hot and the trail was slippery and the rope needed 2 knots rather than 1. Some lessons were taught by experience, and some needed to be installed in advance. She changed the compress every 30 minutes through the day using cloths she kept warm near the stove, so that the cooling was gradual rather than sudden. She fed him broth made from the turnip greens and the last of the salt pork bones, thin and clear, given in small amounts at intervals so his stomach could manage it. She kept the cabin at the highest temperature the stove would produce, burning the wood she had been carefully rationing, because there were situations in which the reserve was the correct thing to spend, and this was one of them. On the second night of his fever, Sam woke and found her sitting beside him, her hand on his forehead, and he looked at her in the dim stove glow, with eyes that were clearer than she had expected. "I'm not going to die," he said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion. She looked at him steadily. "No, you're not." "Good." He turned onto his side and went back to sleep. The certainty in his voice was not bravado. It was the voice of a child who trusts the person holding him, and the weight of that trust was something Clara carried differently than the weight of the wood and the water, and the tools. It did not make her tired. It made her careful. The fifth morning of the blizzard, the fever broke. Sam woke asking for breakfast, specifically the kale cooked in the pan with the last of the salt, and Clara made it for him without commentary, and he ate it with the focused appreciation of someone whose appetite has been restored from the inside, working through the bowl with seriousness. The storm ended in the late morning. The silence was almost louder than the wind had been. Clara dug the entrance open completely, 2 hours of work to clear a passage through what had accumulated to nearly 4 feet of compressed storm snow, and stepped outside for the first time in 5 days, into a world that was entirely white and entirely still and entirely clear. The sky a sharp winter blue that had the quality of something rinsed, scrubbed back to its essential color. The mountain was unrecognizable. Every familiar landmark was a different shape under the snow. The ridgeline softened the trail invisible, the trees laden to the point of geometric abstraction. The cold was the deepest she had encountered since their arrival. Her exhaled breath crystallized immediately, not just steaming, but sparkling, freezing into tiny prisms before it dispersed. She stood at the cave entrance for a moment and looked at it. Then she went back inside and began loading the handcart. The kale was the most visible cargo, its dark leaves unmistakable against the pale snow, when she had the cart half loaded, and it continued to look improbable, in the way it had looked improbable every morning in the garden beds, the fact of something growing when the world outside had decided the correct posture was to stop. She added the stored turnips from the crate she had packed against early harvest, the smoked mutton sections wrapped in cloth, the rolled wool from Nora's spinning work, and 2 sealed jars of the dried herb mix she had assembled from Hollis's instruction. Nora and Sam were ready before she finished loading. Nora had tied the cart rope and checked the balance and pulled her coat sleeves down over her wrists against the cold, and Sam stood beside the cart in his heaviest clothes with his compass in his pocket and his expression indicating that whatever was happening was the correct thing to be doing. "Harland Creek," Clara said. Neither of them asked why. They had been watching the storm for 5 days. They knew what 5 days of blizzard did to a valley at lower elevation with its thinner walls and its depleted wood stocks, and its families who had not spent 3 months building up reserves in a thermally stable limestone cave. They had been down there until September. They knew exactly what that cold felt like from the inside of a poorly heated room with not enough food and children whose bodies had no margin left in them. The trail down was unrecognizable but navigable if you moved carefully, testing the footing before committing, weight reading the ground through the snow by the landmarks that stood above it, the distinctive outcroppings, the creek bends, the tree patterns that had been memorized without specifically intending to memorize them. Clara went first, breaking the surface crust. Nora managed the cart on the descent with the adapted technique she had developed on the ascent 4 months ago, taking the weight against her body on the steep sections and guiding rather than pulling. Sam went last, covering the ground his mother had broken his small boots on, fitting neatly into her footprints. I did a walk behind him. The sheep had simply come when the others left the cave, as if her inclusion was understood by everyone, including herself, and no one had suggested otherwise. She moved through the snow with the competence of an animal designed for exactly this terrain, her broad feet distributing her weight across the crust, and she kept pace with Sam without effort and without drama. The valley opened below them as they came down through the last ridge of pines, and what it showed them was not a town, but the aftermath of a town rooftops buried streets invisible. A silence that was not the good silence of winter rest, but the silence of exhaustion of a place that had been held down and was now very still under the weight of what had held it. Half the chimneys had no smoke. Clara looked at it for a moment from the edge of the tree line. Then she looked at the cart behind her with its improbable cargo of fresh green leaves in the middle of a January that had just done its worst to everything at lower elevation. She started down toward the valley. The street at the bottom of the trail was unnavigable. In the conventional sense, no surface visible, no distinction between road and yard and front step, the entire valley floor rendered into a single white plain that the storm had smoothed into indifference. Clara pulled the cart through it by feel and by memory, following the line of fence posts that emerged from the snow at irregular intervals like the remnants of a sentence that had lost most of its words. Iago walked behind Sam with the steadiness of an animal that has assessed the situation and found it manageable. The cold was the kind that did not bite so much as settle, working its way into the spaces between layers, and Clara had been moving long enough to stay ahead of it, but just barely. The first person she saw was a boy perhaps 10 years old standing in the cleared rectangle of a doorway. Halfway down the main street, watching them approach with the particular alertness of a child who has been inside for a long time and finds anything moving in the external world automatically significant. She did not know him by name. She knew his family by the color of their house, which was pale yellow, faded by several seasons, and by the fact that his father worked at the grain mill and had been one of the men who watched her leave in September without speaking. She stopped at the gate. "Is Dr. Marsh still on Locust Street?" The boy stared at Ida for a moment. Then he pointed west. "His house is open. He's been up all night." She found Owen Marsh on the front step of his office house, sitting in his coat with his black bag beside him and a cup of something cooling in his hands, and he had the appearance of a man who has not stopped working long enough to register that he is exhausted. The signs visible from the outside, but not yet translated into behavior, because there has been no pause in which to receive them. He looked up when he heard the cart. The expression that moved across his face when he saw the kale was not something she could name with a single word. It was compound relief and disbelief and something underneath both of those that was more like a man recalibrating a judgment he had made in error and having the honesty to acknowledge the recalibration. "Mrs. Whitfield," his voice was level, but the levelness was maintained rather than natural. "I have 9 patients who have not had fresh food in 8 days. 3 of them are children under 6. Tell me who needs it most." He picked up his bag and stood and did not waste time on preamble, which she had always respected about Owen Marsh. His efficiency in emergencies was the efficiency of someone who has learned that every minute spent on the approach to a task is a minute taken from the task itself. He led her west on the main street and then north on the cross street, moving through the snow with the practiced stride of a man who had been walking between these houses for the previous 5 days. And she followed with the cart, and Nora followed the cart, and Sam followed Nora, and Ida followed all of them. A procession that the few people visible in windows watched with expressions Clara did not stop to read. The first house was the largest on the North Street, a 2-story clapboard that belonged to a family named Pruitt, and inside it 3 families had consolidated after the storm. 11 people in a space designed for 5 crowded around a fire that had been reduced to the size of frugality by a wood supply that had run out the previous morning. The rooms smelled of too many people in too small a space for too long, and the children sitting against the far wall had the particular pallor of bodies that had been cold and hungry simultaneously, a kind of grayness that was less about color than about the withdrawal of vitality to the interior. Clara set the kale on the table and said nothing explanatory. Marsh took it from there, directing the distribution with the calm authority of a man in his professional element, and Clara stepped back and let him work. From the doorway she watched the woman of the house, a Mrs. Pruitt, perhaps 45, with the build and bearing of someone who had been managing difficulty for long enough that it had become her default posture, handle the kale with the careful attention you give something that might not be real. The woman touched the leaves first, pressing them gently as if checking their structural integrity, then smelled them, and the expression that had crossed her face at the smell of something fresh and green and living in the middle of this January was not performed. It was involuntary. It was the face of a body receiving information it had been waiting for. She looked up at Clara. She did not say thank you immediately, which Clara registered as more honest than the alternative. She said, "How?" "The cave holds heat," Clara said. "The right cave with the right properties holds enough heat to grow through winter." Mrs. Pruitt looked at her for another moment. Then she turned to the distribution of kale with the focused efficiency of a woman who had questions, but understood that the questions belonged to later. The Reverend's house was the fourth stop, not the first, because Marsh's triage had placed the children's situations ahead of the adults, and Clara agreed with his prioritization without needing to say so. Reverend Aldrich met them at the door before they knocked. He had been watching their progress down the street from the window, she gathered, because he was already holding the door open when they reached the step, his face carrying an expression she had not seen on it before and could not immediately categorize. She stepped inside and set the remaining kale and 2 of the turnips on the table near the door. The room held 3 families in addition to Aldrich and his wife, people who had come to the church house in the first days of the storm and had not been turned away, which told her something about Aldrich that she stored without comment alongside everything else she knew about him. He looked at the food on the table. Then he looked at her, and the expression she had not been able to categorize resolved itself into something she recognized. It was the expression of a man who is looking at evidence that contradicts something he said out loud in front of witnesses, and who is honest enough to face that contradiction directly rather than finding a way around it. "I called what you were doing unnatural," he said. The admission was without decoration, which made it worth more than a longer version would have been. Clara pulled her coat straight and looked at him steadily. "What grew in that cave is the most natural thing I've ever had a hand in. The earth made the conditions. I only understood them." She paused for a second, not for effect, but because the next part was something she meant precisely and wanted to say precisely. "Understanding is not the same as controlling, Reverend. It's the same as listening." Aldrich nodded. His wife was already at the table cutting the turnips into portions. The last house on Marsh's list was Bert Calhoun's. She had passed the smithing shop twice already, on different stretches of the street, its forged chimney cold, for the first time she had ever seen it, and she had noted this as she noted everything, as information neither satisfying nor concerning, but present. When Marsh led her to the residential door beside the shop and knocked, it was Calhoun's wife who answered, a thin woman named Ruth, who had the careful eyes of someone managing more than one situation simultaneously. Behind her, 2 small children sat on the floor near a fire that was low but still functioning. Ruth Calhoun's face registered Clara's presence with a complexity of expression that suggested she had been briefed on the history. Clara gave her the last of the kale and the remaining wrapped mutton, and Ruth Calhoun accepted it with both hands and held it for a moment before speaking. "Bert's been asking if there's anything he can do for you. He hasn't known how to ask it directly." "My tools have been taking hard use," Clara said. "When things are easier, the saw needs resetting and the axe head needs rehanging." "He'll do it," Ruth said, "as soon as he can get the forge going again." The transaction had the quality of an accounting that both parties preferred to settle simply and move forward from, and Clara respected Ruth Calhoun for conducting it on those terms. By the time the cart was empty and the afternoon light was failing toward the early dark of January, Clara, Nora, and Sam had covered 7 households. The empty cart was lighter in her hands than the full one had been, which was the obvious physical truth, but there was another quality to it that was harder to account for, a lightness that was not about the weight but about the direction of travel, about having moved through the world in a particular way and having the empty cart as the record of it. She had not made speeches. She had not reminded anyone of anything. She had simply brought what she had grown and given it to the people who needed it, which was either an uncomplicated act of practical humanity or the most complicated thing she had done in months, depending on which angle you approached it from. She found she did not need to decide which. Marsh walked with her to the edge of town as the light went. He had the manner of a man composing something and waiting for the right moment to deliver it, which she had learned was his way when the thing he needed to say was important enough to require care. "There's a man from Elkins," he said at last. "He came through before the storm, staying at Peabody's boarding house. He's been here a week. He represents a land company. He didn't give me the name, but I heard Dunmore's name mentioned in the same sentence more than once." Clara kept walking. "What kind of land company?" "The kind that develops resort properties. Mineral springs. That category of enterprise." Marsh's breath made small clouds in the cold air. He's been asking questions about the ridge, specifically about the thermal properties. She had expected something like this, which did not make it comfortable to hear, but discomfort was not a reason to stop moving. Has he filed anything with the county? Not that I've heard, but the courthouse in Franklin has been closed since the storm. Marsh paused. I want you to know that I have a colleague in Moorfield who has a law contact in Charleston who handles land disputes. I mention this not as advice, but as available information. She looked at him. In the low gray light of the January afternoon, with the empty street behind him and the white mountain ridge visible above the rooftops, Owen Marsh had the appearance of a man who had spent his professional life in the business of providing what he had available to people in need, and who had decided at some point that this was also the appropriate response to situations that were not strictly medical. I'll remember that, she said. She went back up the mountain with the empty cart and her two children and Ida, who had spent the afternoon outside Calhoun's smithing shop investigating a pile of snow-covered barrel staves with focused curiosity, and seemed satisfied with the outcome. The climb was harder than the descent had been. Muscles that had loaded and unloaded and walked and worked for 6 hours registering the total, but the trail was broken now, where they had come down, and the cold was the stable cold of a clear night rather than the dynamic cold of moving weather, and Sam walked without holding anything, his arms free, his stride covering the ground with a confidence that the terrain warranted and that he had earned by 4 months of this mountain under his feet. At the cave entrance, she stopped and turned and looked down at the valley one last time before going in. The lights of Harland Creek were coming on in the houses below, small yellow rectangles in the darkening valley, more of them than there had been at midday, which meant fires were rebuilt and the generators of those fires were moving again. She did not feel the satisfaction of having caused this. The causes were the kale and the turnips and the mutton, which were themselves caused by the thermal fissure and the limestone formation, and Thomas's careful observation and her own 4 months of uninterrupted work. She was one factor in a chain of factors, which was the correct way to understand it. She turned and went inside. The weeks that followed the blizzard had a different quality than the weeks before it. Not easier, the work of maintaining the cave through deep winter was the same work. It had always been, unvaried by outside events, but differently positioned, as if the blizzard had shifted the relationship between the ridge and the valley below it in a way that was slow and unannounced but real. People began to come up, not many and not immediately, but beginning in the 3rd week of January, when the worst of the cold had backed off to merely serious first doctor. Marsh, who climbed the trail on a Sunday morning with his black bag and his coat, and knocked at the cave entrance as formally as if it were an office door, and spent 2 hours looking at the garden beds and the sheep pen and the cabin and the thermal fissure with the systematic attention of a scientist observing something new. He asked questions and she answered them with the same precision he brought to asking, and when he left, he took with him a section of the willow bark she no longer needed and the instruction for preparing it, and he did not offer payment and she did not ask for it. Then Mrs. Pruitt, who came alone on a weekday with the deliberate purpose of someone who has prepared for a visit rather than deciding on impulse. She looked at the garden beds for a long time and then asked, in the direct manner Clara had appreciated in her since the first meeting, whether the method required a cave specifically or whether the principles could be adapted to a surface structure. Clara thought about this with the care the question deserved. The cave provides the thermal stability and the wind protection, she said. Without both, you'd need to create them artificially, which is possible but more expensive. What the cave does is make the conditions cheap because it's already there. She looked at the beds. If you have a root cellar with good drainage and some way to bring in additional light, you could approximate it. Not identically, but enough to extend your growing season considerably into winter. Mrs. Pruitt absorbed this and nodded once, the nod of a person filing information for practical application rather than theoretical interest. A man named Weston, who ran cattle on the lower slopes, came up with his older son and stood at the cave entrance for several minutes before coming inside, as if the act of entering required a specific decision. He was quiet throughout, looking at things with the concentrated inspection of a man who distrusts what he hears, but is willing to be persuaded by what he sees. He left without extensive comment, and she did not see him for another 2 weeks. And then he appeared again with a section of hand-drawn sketch showing the configuration of a depression on his south-facing pasture that he thought might have some of the thermal properties she had described, and wanted to know how to test it. She showed him the method Thomas had described for identifying thermal gradients: the candle test for air movement, the soil temperature, check the botanical indicators like the green moss and the unfrozen ground that she had found at the stream bend in September. He wrote it down in his own notebook, which she recognized as the moment when the information stopped being hers and became shared, which was its correct destination. She did not charge anyone for these conversations. The reason was not generosity in the conventional sense. It was closer to the understanding that the value of the cave was not extractable in the way that cash was extractable, that its value was something it created rather than something it could be reduced to, and that participating in the creation of that value by sharing what she knew was simply the correct use of what she had. It was at the end of January on a morning when the temperature outside was still below zero, but the inside of the cave was holding its familiar 50 degrees, and the kale was producing at the rate she had projected, and the first of the lambs were perhaps 6 weeks away, that the man from the land company came up the mountain. She was at the woodlot when he appeared on the lower trail. Not Dunmore this time, just the man in the city coat who was considerably less well-suited to the conditions than on his previous visit, and was managing the last section of the trail with the labored determination of someone who has committed to a task before fully understanding its physical requirements. She watched him from the woodlot edge, and then she put down the axe and walked to meet him at the cave entrance, because there was no advantage in waiting and some advantage in choosing the ground. He introduced himself as a representative of Allegheny Land and Resource Company based in Pittsburgh. He had the manner of a man who is accustomed to conducting business in circumstances that favor him, and who was aware that the current circumstances did not, but who had a specific professional obligation to make the presentation regardless. He offered her $800 for the full 17 acres plus a payment structure tied to the developed property's future revenues. She listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. This was not courtesy. It was the same instinct she had used with the debt collector's monthly visits, the understanding that the person speaking reveals more than the person waiting, and that what they reveal is usually more useful than what they intend to give you. When he finished, she sat on the flat rock near the cave entrance that had become her default seat for outdoor conversations, and looked at him with the steadiness she had been bringing to difficult conversations since Thomas died. $800, she said. The number was accurate in her voice. She gave it the weight it had, without adding to it or subtracting from it. It's a fair valuation for undeveloped. I know what the land is worth, she said. I know because I've been living on it and working it for 4 months, and I know more about its properties than any assessor your company has sent up here. What I haven't decided is whether you understand that what you're proposing to buy isn't a thermal spring, it's a system. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man recalibrating. The cave, the ridge, the watershed, the thermal gradient across the elevation range, it functions as a system, she said. You can't purchase one element of a system and develop it without affecting the whole. If you build resort infrastructure on this ridge, the watershed changes. The soil changes. The thermal properties may or may not be stable under surface development, and your company's assessor spent 20 minutes here in November, which is not enough time to determine stability. There was a pause. In it, she could hear the distant sound of Nora working in the cave, and the closer sound of the cold wind moving through the upper pines, and both of these sounds were part of the system she had just described, and she was aware of that as she said it. We could arrange a longer assessment, he said. Yes, you could, and I could allow that or not allow it because it's my land and my decision. She stood. What I can tell you is that $800 is not a number that changes my decision, which means the conversation your company needs to have is about what number does. I don't know that number yet because I haven't finished deciding what this land is worth to me. When I know, I'll know the negotiation. She looked at him directly. Go back to Pittsburgh and tell them the owner is not ignorant and is not desperate, and the approach should change accordingly. He went back down the mountain. She watched him go from the woodlot edge, and when he had dropped below the first switchback, she went back to the axe and finished the section she had been cutting because the wood was still needed, and the conversation, however significant, did not change the weight of the cold or the rate at which fuel was consumed. What it changed was the internal accounting, the understanding that the land had a value that was actively growing rather than fixed, that the work she had done over 4 months had not merely kept her family alive, but had produced something that a Pittsburgh land company had sent a man up an icy mountain trail to acquire. This was information, and she filed it the way she filed all information, as a property of the terrain she was working with, something that would have implications whose full shape she could not yet see. Dunmore came up in the second week of February. She had expected him eventually. His willingness to send others first was a tactical choice. The same instinct that had led him to send the formal letter before the personal visit in Harland Creek, exhaust the lower-cost approaches before investing the more expensive currency of his own presence. But the land company representative had gone back without a signed deed, which meant the lower-cost approaches had not worked, which meant Dunmore had reached the limit of the strategy and arrived at the point where he had to spend himself. He came alone. This was different from the November visit, and she registered it as meaningful. Alone meant either confidence or resignation, and the set of his shoulders when he crested the last rise before the cave entrance suggested it was not resignation. She offered him the flat rock. He sat, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to remain standing, which was his professional habit. The act of sitting down had a different quality to it, the quality of a man setting aside the formal register and trying a different one. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," he said. "The company from Pittsburgh is going to make another offer. It will be higher than what they offered before because they've now had the geology report from their assessor and they understand what they're looking at." What are they looking at? A geothermal resource that is unique in this county and possibly in this region. The thermal output from the fissure is large enough to support a significant mineral spa development, the kind that attracts clientele from the eastern cities, the kind of development that generates revenue in amounts that make $800 look like a rounding error. She looked at him. He was telling her the truth, which was a different approach than any of his previous approaches, and she understood it as the most dangerous version of Dunmore, the one who has decided that the direct approach costs less than the indirect one, that treating her as a person with full information is more likely to produce the outcome he wants than treating her as one without it. "You want a percentage of the deal," she said. "I want what I've always wanted," he said, "to be on the right side of a transaction before it closes rather than after." He looked at the cave entrance where the warm air was just barely visible as a slight shimmer in the cold. "I won't pretend I handled this well from the beginning. I offered you $35 for something worth considerably more, and I did it because I calculated you were desperate enough to take it. I was right about the desperation and wrong about the desperation's direction." The admission sat between them in the cold air. She did not reward it with warmth. She did not feel, but she gave it the acknowledgement it was due as an honest statement. "What are you proposing?" "That you let me represent you in the negotiation with the company. I know their methods and I know the land market, and I can get you a number that reflects what this land actually is. My fee comes from their side of the transaction, not yours." She considered this for a long time, long enough that Dunmore, to his credit, did not fill the silence. The proposal had structural merit. He did know the land market, and she did not, and the gap in their respective knowledge of transaction mechanics was real, and would cost her if she tried to negotiate the final deal without someone who understood the terrain. The risk was that Dunmore's interest and hers were aligned only in the narrow band where a higher sale price benefited both of them and diverged everywhere outside it. He would not be her advocate. He would be her agent with a conflicting interest, and she had to weigh the value of his knowledge against the liability of his motivation. She thought about what Thomas would have done. Thomas, who had spent 11 years dealing with landowners and county officials and mining company representatives and the entire complicated human ecosystem of resource extraction country, and who had navigated all of it with the same quiet precision he brought to measurement. "Know what you're looking at," stated. "It plainly don't be moved by what the other party wants you to feel." "I'll consider it," she said. "I want to see the geology report first." Dunmore reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I brought it." She looked at him. The prepared document was the tell he had known she would ask for it, which meant he had modeled this conversation in advance and concluded that transparency was his best instrument. That was useful information, too. It told her he needed this deal, that his position with the Pittsburgh company was more contingent than his manner suggested, that the gray coat and the stillness were at least partly performance. She took the document and read it at the cave entrance, while he waited, and what she read confirmed what she had understood from Thomas's notes and expanded it considerably. The geologist had measured the thermal output in BTUs and had estimated the subsurface water volume and had concluded that the thermal resource at Caldwell Ridge was in the specific technical language of the report of unusual consistency and commercial significance, unlikely to degrade under reasonable surface development. The word unusual appeared in the report in the same position it had appeared in Thomas's notebook, which closed a circle she had not known was open. Thomas had been right. He had been precisely right with a surveyor's notebook and no instruments beyond careful attention, and he had been right 2 years before anyone with professional equipment arrived to confirm it. She folded the report and held it. "I'll give you an answer in 2 days," she said. Dunmore went down the mountain. She went inside. Nora was at the garden beds harvesting the morning's kale, moving through the row with the methodical efficiency that had become second nature to her over 4 months of this same task. She looked up when Clara came in and read her mother's expression with the accuracy she had always had for Clara's internal weather. Something happened. Yes. Clara sat down on the cabin step. Someone wants to buy this land for a significant amount of money. Nora was quiet for a moment. She had learned somewhere in the last 4 months the particular patience that her father had always had, the willingness to wait for the complete information before forming the response. "Are you going to sell it?" "I don't know yet." Clara looked around the cave. The garden beds, the cabin, the sheep pen, the thermal fissure in the right wall doing its quiet, constant work. "I'm trying to figure out what we'd be selling." "We'd be selling the land," Nora said, "not what we built on it. The land and what's in it are not separable." Nora set down the kale she was holding and looked at her mother with the direct assessment of someone who has thought about this before, perhaps without knowing she was thinking about it. "What did Papa think it was?" Clara looked at the fissure. "He thought it was worth returning to." She made her decision that evening. She was not going to sell. She had known this since the land company man had come down from Pittsburgh, known it in the way, things that are not yet language, as a settled weight, a completed equation. But the decision required examination before it could be trusted, and she had examined it from every practical angle. She could reach the money, the freedom from development, risk, the possibility of taking the proceeds and establishing somewhere more conventional. All of those had the logic of additions, adding security, adding certainty, adding the particular relief of not having to fight. What they subtracted was the thing she could not price. Thomas had written worth returning to about a place that nobody wanted. He had seen its value through measurement and attention rather than through conventional categories, and he had left enough of his observations behind that she had been able to find her way here and confirm what he knew and go beyond it. Selling the land to a company that would develop it for the clientele of eastern cities was not wrong exactly, but it was the ending of a conversation that she was not ready to end. The conversation between the land and the people who understood it, specifically not as a resource to extract from, but as a system to participate in. She did not use these words to herself because these were not her kind of words. She arrived at the same conclusion by its practical edges. The cave could do more than it had done. The information about geothermal agriculture in Appalachian limestone was real and useful and not documented anywhere, and the people who could most use it were people like Weston and Mrs. Pruitt and the families in the lower valley who had spent 5 days of blizzard in thinly heated rooms with not enough food. Selling the land meant the end of that information being generated. She wrote her answer to Dunmore the following morning and sent it down by the hardware merchant's son, who came up the mountain twice a week now. With small supply orders she placed in advance. She was not selling, but she was willing to discuss a lease arrangement for a limited portion of the ridge, specifically the lower plateau, that would allow a development while preserving her ownership of the cave and the immediate surrounding acreage. The lease terms were to be negotiated by her directly without a broker. If the company wanted the resource, they could negotiate for access to it on her terms or not at all. She did not hear from Dunmore for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, February moved into March with the slow reluctance of a season that knows it is losing, but has not yet finished making its case. The snowpack began to consolidate, settling from the light powder of the deep winter into the dense blue-white of approaching thaw. The creek at the base of the drainage, which had been fully frozen through January, began running again at the center channel, the sound of moving water reaching up through the still air on the clear mornings, as if the mountain were clearing its throat. Inside the cave, the lambs arrived. 3 of them over the course of 2 mornings in early March, each arrival announced by the particular sounds of the sheep pen that were distinct enough to wake Clara from deep sleep at 2 in the morning, with the specific alertness of someone who has been waiting without consciously waiting. The first 2 were from the gray-faced ewe and were small and definitive, arriving with the certainty of things that have completed a process and are simply presenting the result. The third arrived from the younger of the 2 remaining ewes with considerably more drama, requiring Clara's hands in the cold, early dark, her voice steady and low, to keep the mother calm. Nora besotted by her holding the lantern. Sam woken by the noise and standing in the cabin doorway, with wide eyes and the lamp's glow on his face. Sam named them before anyone suggested he might, moving through the pen the next morning, with a quiet seriousness, and stopping at each animal and sitting with it, and arriving after some internal consultation at his designations, Hope for the first, Clover for the second, and Button for the third, who was the smallest and had the officious expression of an animal who intends to compensate for size with attitude. Clara looked at her son crouching in the straw with his compass in his coat pocket and his hand on the smallest lamb's back, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has found the specific work that matches the specific shape of who he is, and she thought he is going to be exactly what he is, and what he is sufficient. Dunore's response came in the 3rd week of March, 2 weeks after the lambs were born, which gave that arrival a particular texture. New life in the cave and resolution arriving from the valley on the same stretch of days. His acceptance letter was written in the careful language of a man who has consulted with his legal contact and understood the position he is negotiating from, and it was in its way the clearest communication she had ever received from him, the language of someone who has stopped calculating what you don't know and started calculating what you do. She responded with the lease terms she had drafted with Marcia's Charleston contact, who had sent her a form letter in January that she had used as a framework and adapted with the specific provisions she needed. The cave and the immediate acreage were excluded from the lease, entirely held in perpetuity. The garden beds, the sheep, the cabin, these were hers in all conditions. The lower plateau, 6 of the 17 acres, could be developed under the lease terms for a period of 20 years, with renewal provisions at a rate that Marcia's contact had verified was above standard market for the region. Dunore signed it in the 1st week of April. She did not feel triumph when she received the countersigned document. She felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been solved by sustained attention, rather than forced the satisfaction of having read the terrain correctly and moved through it accordingly. It was the same satisfaction she felt when a garden bed produced at the rate she had planned for, or when a structural joint held under load, or when the kale grew dense in the lantern light, while the mountain winter worked itself out against the cave walls. The letter from Gerald arrived the same week, which gave those April days a density of resolution and feeling that Clara had not experienced since the September morning when she had opened the burlap package and found everything that had set this in motion. She had not been thinking about Gerald. He existed in her mind as a fixed point in the backstory, the sender of the deed, the writer of the letter that said useless, and thereby set everything in motion, but not as an ongoing presence, not as someone who was thinking about her while she was not thinking about him. The letter arrived with the hardware merchant's son, who handed it to her without comment at the cave entrance, and she turned it over and recognized the large, unsteady handwriting from the burlap package 7 months ago. She opened it, standing at the entrance with the April light on the page. "Mrs. Clara, I have heard your name from a wool merchant in Elkins, who asked me if I was related to the Whitfield woman on Caldwell Ridge, and I said I was. He told me what he had heard, which was considerable. I don't know what to make of it, except that I am glad the land went to someone who could see it. Thomas used to write to me, not often but regularly, and I have been reading back through his letters. He mentioned the ridge 3 times over 2 years. He called it the most interesting piece of ground he had surveyed in his career. I did not know what he meant when he wrote it. I understand it better now. He would have brought you there himself eventually when he had worked out what he wanted to say about it. He was careful that way. He did not say things until he was certain of them. I am sorry he ran out of time to be certain. I think he knew you would find your way without being told, which is either a tribute to his confidence in you or a failure of his nerve, and I have been unable to decide which. Perhaps both. GW. She read the letter 3 times, which was the same number of times she had read the letter that came with the deed, and for the same reason the first reading received it, the second reading understood it, and the third reading let it settle into the place where things that are permanently true live. The first and second readings she conducted standing. For the third, she sat down on the flat rock near the cave entrance, and she read Gerald's words about his brother with the attention they deserved, and she let what they described Thomas's care, Thomas's certainty, Thomas's particular form of love that expressed itself through preparation rather than declaration, arrive at its full weight without managing it. She did not cry immediately. She cried after she had read the letter for the third time and folded it along its creases and held it in her hands and looked out at the April morning, which was the kind of morning that announces itself completely, all the colors sharp, the air clean from the overnight cold, the new grass pushing up through the thawed ground on the south-facing slope below the cave, with the same directed force the kale had shown in the garden beds, the force of something growing because the conditions are right. She cried because Thomas had been careful, and careful had not been enough to give him more time, and because he had left her what he had in the form, he had it in not explanation, not instruction, just observation, the record of what he had seen and thought was worth preserving, and she had been able to use it, which was either the best possible outcome or the one that cost the most to arrive at, and she was finally in April in a position to hold both of those things at once without needing to choose between them. Nora found her there. The girl sat beside her on the rock without asking what was happening, and without attempting to redirect what was happening, and without speaking at all, which was the correct response, and which Clara had apparently taught her without knowing she was teaching it. They sat together until Clara was finished, which took as long as it took, and then Clara refolded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and looked out at the slope. He knew, Nora said eventually. Not a question. He knew enough, Clara said. He left the rest to us. The day she started the spring planting, the signed lease folded in the crate beside Thomas's tools, Clara turned the first bed with his short spade, which was old enough now that the handle had the smooth gray polish of well-used wood, the kind of surface that only years of hands creates. She worked the compost in breaking the clumps, leveling the surface, feeling the temperature of the soil through the metal of the spade, the same way Thomas had felt the temperature of an elevation, reading through the level of his instrument, not as external data, but as something the body received and the mind then organized. Nora appeared at the bed beside her and began the same work in the adjacent frame, and they worked in parallel for a while without speaking the rhythm between them, as automatic now, as it had been in the first weeks of the cabin construction, each aware of the other's movement without needing to track it consciously. Nora was taller by 2 inches than she had been in September. Her hands were the same as her father's had been in this light wide across the knuckles, direct in movement, the hands of someone who has learned to trust what they can feel. From outside the cave, the sound of Sam's voice came in talking to the lambs in the pen he had moved to the exterior on the mild April days, letting them have the grass on the south slope that was coming in thick and green from the snowmelt. He was telling Buttons something about the compass, explaining how the needle worked, and his voice had the patient precision of a teacher who knows the material and believes the listener is capable of understanding it if given adequate explanation. Clara paused in her work and listened to her son's voice explaining the relationship between magnetic north and the direction of travel, and the care in his explanation, the refusal to oversimplify, was so precisely the quality that Thomas had brought to every instruction he had ever given her that she was still for a moment not from grief, not from loss, but from the recognition that some things move through people the way water moves through limestone, finding the passages that already exist, emerging somewhere unexpected, and continuing without interruption. She went back to the planting. The April light came in through the cave entrance at the angle it had been coming in every morning since their arrival, changing quality as the season turned warmer, now more horizontal, reaching further into the cave interior than the low winter angle had allowed. Where it reached, it illuminated the dark soil of the garden beds in a way the lantern never had, showing the precise texture of the surface, the individual particles of the compost she had been building for months, the slight shimmer where the soil held moisture and reflected. She had not needed the lantern over the beds since the first week of March. The spring outside the cave was doing what the cave had been doing through the winter, producing. The south slope below the entrance was covered now in the new grass that Ida and the other sheep had been discovering, with the enthusiasm of animals emerging from a season of dried fodder, moving through the green with the measured deliberateness of creatures who have learned not to rush what can be grazed at a considered pace. Ida herself was at the far edge of the slope, moving in the slow, systematic pattern of an animal conducting a survey, which was perhaps not an entirely inappropriate parallel. In the evening after the planting was done, and the beds were watered, and the animals were in for the night, and the stove had been fed, Clara sat at the cave entrance with the surveying notebook open on her knee. She had been adding to it steadily since September. Her entries in the blank pages at the back, now nearly as numerous as Thomas's entries in the front, their two handwritings meeting somewhere in the middle of the book, like two parties who have been traveling toward each other from opposite directions and have finally arrived at the same point. She wrote the day's measurements: soil temperature, plant growth, sheep condition, external temperature, daylight hours. She wrote Sam's note about the lamb's feed rate. She wrote the specific quality of the April light on the soil and how far it reached into the cave now compared to January. Then she wrote TW was right. This is the most interesting piece of ground I have surveyed. I intend to keep surveying it. She closed the notebook. Nora was mending by lamplight inside the cabin, the needle moving through wool with the same even confidence it had moved through the grain sack in the Harland Creek room 8 months ago, except that the confidence now had different roots. Not the patience of someone managing difficulty, but the ease of someone working in conditions they have built for themselves. The lamp above her threw her shadow long against the cabin wall and across the cave floor toward the thermal fissure, and the fissure continued its quiet exhalation unchanged by any of the previous month's events, indifferent to the human accounting of all that had happened in its vicinity, simply doing what it had always done. Sam came in from the outside pen and stopped at the cave entrance to pull off his boots, and he looked at his mother, sitting at the entrance, with the notebook closed on her knee, and said, Ida found a new part of the slope today, on the east side where the rock ledge is. There's green moss under the ledge where it doesn't get snow. Warm ground, Clara said. I felt it. He held up his hand as the evidence, same as the moss by the stream. She looked at her son's hand held open in the April evening, the compass bulge visible in his coat pocket, and she understood that what he was showing her was not just the temperature he had felt, but the fact of having felt it and recognized it and connected it to the larger pattern, which was what Thomas had done at the beginning, and what she had done in the months since, and what Sam at 8 years old was beginning to do for the first time and would be doing for the rest of his life. Write it down, she said. He went to get a piece of paper. She put her hand flat against the rock beside the cave entrance, not the warm rock inside the outer rock, the cold limestone face of the ridge that had stood here through every winter before this one and would stand here through every winter after. Cold on the outside, holding warmth within, the mountain's particular arithmetic. She left her hand against the stone for a moment, feeling what it held. Then she stood, picked up the notebook, and went inside to start the evening fire.